Welcome back to the final session of the day. We are bringing the conference home with a powerful final couple of hours. Find your seats, get comfortable because we are all the way through to the end. Isn't it nice to be back together again, united in one room after our breakout sessions? I hope you had a fantastic day with your breakout sessions. The session we have now is titled Advancing Australia's National Anti-Racism Framework. In partnership with stakeholders, the Australian Human Rights Commission is creating a national anti-racism framework to guide efforts more effectively across public, private and community sectors. And moderating this discussion, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Australia's Race Discrimination Commissioner, Giri Sivaraman. Please make him very welcome.
Thanks very much. Might start here, but then I'm going to sit with my panelists. So thank you all for being here today. Wonderful to see such an amazing crowd, and it's been an incredible event. I just want to do a shout out to the Australian Human Rights Commission and the various people that have been involved in the organising. Something like this doesn't come together easily, and they've just done an incredible job putting this on. So round of applause for the commish. My name is Giri Sivaraman, or Giridharan Sivaraman. Giridharan only became a thing when I became the commissioner. Until that point, only one random cousin used to call me that. But anyway, I thought I'd embrace my whole me when I became the Race Discrimination Commissioner, because that is one of my things. And of course, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are here today, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's a great time to have this discussion. It's as Charles Dickens, we live in the best of times, we live in the worst of times. We're in a febrile time, there's no doubt about it. Social cohesion is low, but you don't get to social cohesion without first dealing with racism. And it is incredibly difficult to even talk about racism yet, let alone actually confront it. And what we seem to see in our society is that whenever there are ruptures or significant moments, racism streams out of those ruptures, and sometimes it's almost overwhelming. And we've seen that in very recent times. At the start of the COVID epidemic, there was huge anti-Asian racism. During the Voice referendum and even since, there's been huge racism against First Nations people. And now, since the Israel-Palestine conflict, there's been an increase in anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism. The question that I have is, if racism can so quickly disperse through those ruptures, are there systemic or foundational problems within our society that allowed that to happen? And why is it so hard to talk about racism? I wrote an op-ed very recently where I said that the person who calls out racism often gets attacked far more than the actual racism itself. And what do you know? I actually got attacked for that op-ed straight after. So kind of case in point. We have an incredibly impressive panel, and I'm going to introduce them one by one. I'm hoping they do sort of a bit of a runner onto the stage and with a fist up. So I'll start with Professor Noreen Young. Noreen, round of applause. Noreen is a First Nation. Oh, go to the next one. I'll sit here. Yeah, thanks. Sorry. Noreen is a First Nations Employment and Employment Diversity Leader. She's the Associate Dean, Indigenous Leadership and Engagement at UTS, and she's a kick-ass unionist. I know that from decades gone by. Because I often think that class and race and the intersection between two is forgotten, right? But here we go. Noreen can tell us about it. Next up, I'd like to ask Alan Wu to come up. Alan, are you there? Alan is a racial justice expert, a board member, a lawyer, and a community power builder. I love that. It's all about community when you want to combat racism. Next up, she's been on panels before. I'm so glad that she's on this one here. Sisonke Msimang. Sisonke. I wanted a Winnie Mandela kind of, walk up. That's it. I say that because she's actually written a biography about Winnie Mandela. Sisonke is an anti-racism and women's rights advocate, a writer, a commentator, a published author, a regular Guardian columnist, and maybe most importantly for today, a storyteller. And we're going to hear some of those stories. Next up, Benny Bowl. Come on down. Benny's, well, firstly, he's going to be the tallest person on this panel, but more importantly, Benny's a dear, close friend of mine from Queensland. I've stacked this panel with Queenslanders today because that's where I come from. Queenslander! Benny's a refugee and migrant advocate. He's a president of the Queensland African Communities Coalition. He holds 2 master's degrees. And I think most significantly for me, his name is on the National Monument to Migration here in Sydney. Betty, how do I get my name on the monument? Next up, I'd like to ask Associate Professor Jeff Levy to come up. Thanks, Jeff. Jeff is a political theorist at UNSW. He actually established and directed the UNSW program in Jewish studies. He's a prominent contributor to Australian and international debates on multiculturalism and minority rights, and we're really glad that you're here with us today. Thanks very much, Jeff. And finally, certainly not least, Nora Amath. Nora, please come up. Another Queenslander. I told you I'd stack the panel. Nora is an expert community developer and a sociologist. She's an adjunct research fellow at Griffith University, and she's also the current executive director at the Islamophobia Register. And thank you so much for being here as well, Nora. So now I'm going to join the crew, and hopefully you can still hear me. Yes, you can. That's good. And I thought I would start with Noreen. I really think it's important to start with the First Nations perspective. Any work that we do against racism has to be centred around First Nations.
First Nations first.
First Nations first. I'm with you there. But Noreen, you've been a strong and successful advocate about racism against First Nations people in employment in particular. I know that's been a great area of focus. So I really want you to tell us, what are the systemic racist barriers in employment against First Nations people? What do you think are the most significant issues?
Thanks, Gary. I'd like to firstly acknowledge country as well, and acknowledge that we're on the land of the Gadigal, who I'm descended from, the Gadigal clan of the Sydney Basin, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, and our ancestors, Hylil, who walk with us, and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Torres Strait Islander people today. And I can see one kiddo just in front of me who I'm very glad's here. So I'd like to do that first. Racism. So we actually don't have any data on the levels of racism experienced by First Nations job seekers. In all the talk about First Nations people and employment, we've never asked, well, why we're not getting the jobs that we want. We know that racism within workplaces is really problematic. We did a survey at Jumbunna, where I work. I still hold a substantive position as Professor of Indigenous Policy, Indigenous workforce diversity at the Jumbunna Indigenous Institute. We did a survey 4 years ago, and we're about to do it again, called Gariella Speak the Truth in Wiradjuri, and thanks to the elders for letting us use that language. And that indicated incredibly high levels of racism that Indigenous people encounter at work. So that's the first 2 levels, and we have data. But then there's the bias around, so there's recruitment, there's retention, and then there's promotion. So what we find, the only place I've ever been able to measure where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are in the workforce is a few years ago, I was asked by the New South Wales Public Service Commission to do a benchmarking exercise for them around where people were, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were across the nation. And of course, we couldn't do that benchmarking exercise because nobody would give us their data. But we did some work, and we know it's like that, right? So I know that the APS have introduced targets now, but racism, racism and racism at every level. I think the thing about the Gariella survey to me typifies what the racism looks like around our people and work, because in all the talk, every election time, Tony Abbott specialised in it, about bludgeoning blacks and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people not working, etc., etc., etc. Nobody had ever thought to ask us what our experiences might be in the workplace. Gariella is the first time that that was done, and I've talked to you about some of what the survey of Aboriginal people the survey was led by Aboriginal people in Indigenous research methodology, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So that was the short answer, Giri. Racism, racism and racism.
Yeah. Thanks. And on that issue of data and racial literacy and collection of data, that's something we'll come back to, because that is one of the things that we're focusing on in the National Anti-Racism Framework. But one of the issues that I'm also interested in, and I might throw to Alan on this, is, and all of us experience this in different ways, and people on this panel and people out there, it's that intersectionality when you have a number of different attributes. Now, Alan, you possess one attribute that nobody else on this panel has. You're young.
Okay.
Sorry, no disrespect to the rest of the panel there. Sorry, I just landed myself in it. But we're wise. You're young. No, that's fine. But you're a young Australian. You're a young Australian of Asian origin. You're a member of the LGBTIQ+ community. And of course, that intersection of race and other attributes, I don't, attribute is a formal term, but those other parts of you affects you and affects the communities you work with. And I just thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that intersectionality operates in the communities you work with.
Thanks, Giri. Yeah, and can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm on the board of the Victorian Pride Centre, so this is a live issue for us. And I'm reminded of the situation last year, where as queer organisations, along with all Australians, we had to consider our role in engaging our communities on the recent referendum. And this is how I think of it. The queer community, more than many others, knows the power of a yes vote. And the same-sex marriage survey results turned out to be momentous and affirmative. But as a gay person of colour, what will stick with me was the realisation that support for marriage equality was really softest in migrant communities, communities that do often vote for progressive policies. And that configuration is obscured by the final result. But that sense of betrayal of one of my communities by another is on paper and in the numbers forever. And I think for me, there is something really brutal about those numbers. It's a suspicion that some of your fellow Australians do not wish for you the same opportunities in future. And it's manifest and crystallized in black and white. And so I really thought it was something that we had to do, really try our hardest to not let happen again. And if we had not been active in engagement in education around the referendum, I think our First Nations friends, including those who are part of the queer community, would feel right, would be right to feel that when we were called on after having gone through something remarkably similar a few years before, that we were not there. That once we had won respect and esteem for ourselves and our relationships, we considered that fight over, and in refusing to lend support to others, we had pulled the ladder up behind us. And that really would have been, an act of bastardry and betrayal, not only of First Nations communities, but also of our own community's own history of activism. And so that's why I think our communities, when called to do so, must recognize that our own experiences with the sharp edges of the world mean that the struggle for the recognition of the depth of one's humanity, it's a struggle that we know all too well. It's been our struggle, and it should be the struggle to which we will always lend our support. So my reflection, Giri, is that it doesn't serve our communities, whether they're communities of colour or queer communities or young communities, to act in isolation or to view ourselves in competition when in fact we're united by the same aim. we should instead be making promises to push each other forward. Wherever there are people yearning for dignity and justice, we will rally with you. Wherever there are people fighting to be admitted as equal members of our community, we will fight alongside you. We will replenish the front lines of social progress together, because as they say, my liberation is bound up in yours.
Oh, beautiful. Well, the future is bright with young people like you, Alan, that's for sure. I might throw to Sisonke next, because you heard in the sense of, I know, hard act to follow, but I know you can do it. But one of the things that I think I noticed in terms of the first two answers, I mean, they were talking about processes or campaigns. Well, in Noreen's case, you're talking about the lack of data, but data is a mechanism by which you can often seek to agitate for change. And then Alan, of course, we're talking about actually building coalitions of support in a particular way. But there are different ways in which you can build support to fight racism, and data is clearly an important tool. But Sisonke, I know that you're a storyteller, and you talked about the power of storytelling. Humor me for 20 seconds, a story that came up when Sisonke and I first met, which was only this week. And this is the power of stories, just in the conversation, is that we discovered we went to the same primary school in Lusaka, Zambia, about 41 years ago, which is kind of remarkable. In completely, both displaced though. My family displaced by the civil war in Sri Lanka, your family displaced as in exile from South Africa due to your father's work with the ANC. But really, just tell us, Sisonke, storytelling. How or why is storytelling powerful to combat racism?
I guess, for me, the thing about storytelling is that it is the oldest app invented by humans, right? So like, if you want people to learn something, you can give them an instruction, or you could tell the kids about this monster that lives in the river. And if you go anywhere near, the same thing will happen to you that happened to that small boy 3,000 years ago, right? The kids are going to remember the story. So storytelling is an app for education. It's it's an app for remembering things and for helping us connect with the things that matter to us. So for that reason alone, I love storytelling, and it's something that, I find particularly important. But of course, when it comes to racism, we know that people are moved by stories. Yeah. So my favorite, one of my favorite humans in the world was Mary Lou Kaunaki, who was the Benedictine nun, and she says, engrave this upon your heart. There isn't a person that you couldn't love once you've heard their story, right? So stories give us that connection between a thing that happened and then a way of understanding and embracing it. And when it comes to racism, we understand that people are on a journey. We have to understand when it comes to racism that there are huge amounts of defensiveness. I think Australia is such a good example of a country in which the stakes feel incredibly high for white people in admitting their racism. And yet is a historical fact that this country has a deeply racist history, continues to exercise racism in profoundly contemporary ways. And yet there is something profoundly difficult about accepting and admitting that for many, many white people. It is what it is. So I won't fight it anymore. We have to figure out ways to address it. And one of the ways to address that is to really help people to think about their own story and how their story counts in relation to others. And I'll just say quickly that one of the methodologies that I use when I do storytelling for social justice is that whenever I'm in a room with people and we begin to sit down, we do these small workshops, and there'll be the most powerful person in the room will often say, you know what, I'm gonna sit this out because I want other people to share their stories. I don't really have a story to tell, because privilege equates to no story to tell, right, in their mind. And then the least powerful person will often come to me and say, you know what I have to say doesn't matter. I can't articulate it in a way that's fancy, and I don't want the other people to laugh at me. So the most powerful person will often not be interested in sharing their story. And the least powerful person will often not want to share their story. And so the insistence that everybody listens to one another, because opting out of a story is opting out of vulnerability. And of course, opting out can come from a place of vulnerability. So we often insist in the work that I do in storytelling that we have to hear one another in very deep ways. And the power of storytelling is not just the power of telling the story, it's the power of having to be forced to listen to the story. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Samantha. I definitely want to read more of your stories. Such a beautiful storyteller. But you talked about vulnerability, and I just want to tie that back to, I'm going to throw to Nora next, in terms of, it's the same thing I raised a bit with Alan, the vulnerability that comes from intersectionality. And Nora, of course, you're a woman of color, and you're Muslim, and those three things can intersect in particular ways. And you've actually spoken eloquently and beautifully about it in the past. But I guess in this current environment that we're in, this febrile time, how do you see that intersection manifesting in terms of the racism? You don't have to talk about yourself necessarily, but in terms of the communities of people like you and how they experience it.
Thanks, Gary. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people and pay my respects to the elders past, present, emerging, and any in the room today. So intersectionality. Well, I'm the triple whammy. I'm Asian, I'm Muslim, I'm female. Actually, there's a fourth whammy. I'm a hijab wearing sister. And as Zahra really eloquently this morning pointed out and spoke about her experiences and the experiences of those of her friends as well as family members about their experiences of wearing the hijab. Really, I share that. I think I was nodding the whole time, and probably many in the room who do wear the headscarf as a marker of their faith and in a very public way do share those experiences. And the look, as a visible marker of my faith, the hijab brings unique challenges, but it also brings opportunities. And I want to talk about both as well, because sometimes we focus so much on the challenges of Islamophobia, and we need to talk about those things, because in order, and I keep saying this, in order to talk about social inclusion, we need to start with social exclusion. We need to know why people feel excluded, or even the perceived exclusion, the perceived, psychological exclusion as well. These are really important terms when we talk about racism, because all too often we talk about what is visible. And I want to talk also about what is invisible, but in this case, this is visible. And what does that mean for me in a very physical way is that, yes, this includes verbal assault. This includes physical assault. It includes the micro aggressions that are both sexist and Islamophobic. So, for example, I've been asked if I'm oppressed. Oh, I can't even remember how many times I've been asked that question. Or if my husband or my father forced me to wear it, or my brothers forced me to wear it. Again, assumptions that really undermine who I am, my own agency, to more or less say that as a Muslim woman, I cannot make a choice in a matter that I deeply feel very passionate about. Sorry, I use my hands a lot, so this is going to happen a few times. So we really ignore the diverse reasons why a Muslim woman chooses to dress a certain way or not dress a certain way based on societal's, expectations. And these intersectional identities also impact my personal safety. And I'm talking about myself, my personal safety, my mental well-being, the constant vigilance that's required to navigate public spaces, and the stress of anticipating discrimination can take a toll on somebody's mental health, Muslim females' mental health. And this is found over and over and over. We've highlighted this in our Islamophobia Register Australia research. I know that the Commission in their 2021 published report on sharing the stories of Australian Muslims have also highlighted this. So it's exhausting. So anytime there's a high profile terrorist attack, we literally get on our phone. As a Muslim female, I will tell you this. Well, actually, the whole Muslim leadership, but as a Muslim female, we get on our phone and we're just keeping up to date with the news, whether it's or social media platforms over and over, and literally telling ourselves and on WhatsApp groups, please don't let it be a Muslim. Please don't let it be a Muslim. Please don't let it be a Muslim. And then if it's not a Muslim, it's a sigh of relief. That shouldn't be my response to the fact that there's been a terrorist attack. That shouldn't be the response that, a sense of relief, because I should be grieving, I should be upset, I should be sad, and I should be hurt, I should be shocked, I should be all these things about the event itself. And yet, at that moment in time, my human instinct is to say, I can actually walk the street tomorrow. I can enter, a train, or I can do this, I can do that, and not worry for my physical safety. But if it is a terrorist attack that, could be perpetuated by, say, a Muslim, then it's getting on the phone. Please be careful. Do you have to go out tomorrow? Why don't you stay back? This is what we navigate every day. So those are really the, I guess, overt racism that intersectionality plays in the sense of a very visible Muslim sister. But there's also the very, what I call the covert, which is, and there are two things that sometimes play out, and it's well-intentioned. It's absolutely well-intentioned. And this is the thing with racism that is so insidious. There are times when I'm pitied. I'm pitied. You could go so much better in your career if you didn't wear this, or you could do this. So the constant pity, you don't need to wear this. You don't need to be this way. You don't need to be that way, as if I need to be saved as a Muslim sister. Then there's also the exceptionalism. And I take great offense to this, because once you speak and engage with me, you realize, actually, she speaks pretty perfect English. Forget that I have 2 degrees in linguistics, but let's just say I speak perfect English. And then I'm pretty darn charming and smart. You laughed, so it must be charming. And then you exceptionalize me. And I know that's not a word, exceptionalize. And coming from 2 linguistics degrees, but I wanted to put that out there. But oblige me here. You see me as an exception. And I get told this, oh, wow, you're so incredible. You're so incredible for a Muslim female. You must be an exception. Oh, your husband lets you travel by yourself? You left home at 18 to study, never went back home. Wait, you've got a PhD, have 3 kids and a grandmother, and doing all these amazing things. How have you decided despite your faith? So there's, like I said, it's a personal safety, psychological, but there are these really covert racism, pity, and I need to do a paper on this, pity and exceptionalism that we probably navigate on a very regular basis that doesn't get spoken about. So intersectionality for me is all these layers and layers of complexity and nuances, what it means to just try to navigate in a public space and just be, rather than who you'd like me to be or who you see me to be.
Thank you. That was incredibly insightful. One of the things you talked about, I'm going to throw to Benny in a second, is the toll that it takes. And Benny, you've been a strong advocate for refugees in this country and in Queensland, particularly refugees of African background. But once there may have been a moment of weakness, I don't know, it was a sad conversation between us. You said to me, refugees and the refugees you represent come to this land with incredible hope and faith and belief in a better future. But for some, sadly, over time, it turns to despair and hopelessness, and racism plays a real part in that. How does racism play a part in that?
Thank you so much. I think I just want to acknowledge everyone here, and I want to pay my respect to the elders, both past, present, and emerging. And I think over the past few years, for a lot of people that have been watching me on the media and also in the community, I made a very deliberate decision to kind of stop talking about or worrying about racism in general and try to look at what needs to be done. So what aspect of racism should we talk about? And I thought about the importance of, or the relationship between power and what's happening in our society. And I think if the conversation shifts from getting upset about racism in general to responsibility and accountability, I think that's so important. And the question is, who is responsible to fix racism or systemic discrimination? And you can see a clear link between power, authority, and racism. And for me personally, what hurts the most are the comments that are made by people in the position of power and authority, and the behavior of the people in the position of leadership. And if we want to see a difference as a country, we need to look at the same multiculturalism that we see in the park when people are celebrating festivals. Our institutions should also reflect that diversity. And most importantly, the role of leadership. Leadership across different sectors, leadership at all different levels. If you go to workplaces, for instance, and you don't see that diversity, the people that allocate resources and appoint people into the position of management and all of that, if we want to address racism and want to see people feeling belong and included, we need to look at leadership in this country. And I think there's something about us as a country, Australia. We don't like to have a conversation about power. The moment you start to talk about power and leadership, you can see things change. And it's important that we identify genuine leaders that are ready to change the status quo. And I've seen very few people that step up. And every story, success story of a migrant or a refugee or First Nation people, if you hear someone who has done something great, you can clearly link that to someone who was in the position of leadership and believe in them and empower them. That's the only way you can change things. For me, I just want to make it clear, when you see the number of our young people in the criminal justice system, it's growing quite significantly. And I go to a lot of different youth detention centers every week, and the numbers are increasing significantly. And that's because young people don't feel belong. These people that have created different identity for them, they don't feel they belong to this country. And if those people in the position of power and leadership, regardless of private, community, or other sectors, if they step up and provide opportunities for people that don't look like them, that can inspire young people. They can feel belong. If you work hard, you can be somewhere. So for me personally, what I would like to share with everyone, Gary, is the importance of identifying like-minded people, genuine leaders who are ready to step up and change the status quo. That's the only way we can change issues to do with racism in this country. Thank you.
Thanks, Betty. It's a great point, Benny. There are leaders at this table, there are leaders out here, but the old union adage, united we bargain, divided we beg, right? It's the same for this. When you want to fight against racism, you need allies and supporters, because there are plenty enough people who attack you and bring you down. So really strong point. Jeff, I thought it'd be good to come to you last in terms of these questions, because you've written extensively on Jewish politics, the politics of multiculturalism, and what do you think now, particularly as a scholar of multiculturalism, are the most significant issues of racism causing social disruption in Australia?
Thanks, Gary. I'm not going to give an acknowledgement, not because I don't endorse it. It's because if I start, I'll spend my 4 minutes talking about this country's shameful treatment of its First Nations. So I want to reserve some minutes for what I've been asked. Racism is typically experienced in the first person, even when it's experienced systemically. And my co-panelists have shared some of that experience here this evening. But Gary, you've asked me a general question, so I'm going to highlight a general phenomenon and problem. When there are international flare-ups or outrages. Ethnic or religious minorities associated with the offending actor, international actor, are typically targeted in Australia. That was the case with Chinese Australians when China was accused of spawning the COVID-19 virus. And of course, it's the case today with Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attacks and Israel's conduct in the Gaza war. There's two things going on there. One is the ascription of collective responsibility, but the other thing is even more fundamental. It's the penchant for delineating people into groups. And this last feature is actually a default, even a natural tendency. Our mental maps, our sense of the social topography or geography is typically to assign people to groups. Often that is harmless, often it's innocuous, sometimes it's even positive. If somebody said African Americans have rhythm, nobody would much mind. Of course, the problem is when the group characterization is demeaning, derogatory, exclusionary, or vilifying. But there are two other complications here. One is that the group ascription is often wrong. It's often a misdescription. People are misidentified with groups, especially in highly immigrant-rich societies. And the second problem is normative. As liberal democratic citizens, we have our own individual status and standing. We have our own bundle of individual rights. We have our own status, our own relationship to the state and to fellow citizens. So I think that we don't do a good job in this country of teaching our young folk and people in general how to think about, understand, and negotiate the rather confusing terrain of acceptable and non-acceptable groupisms, or even when no groupism is really appropriate and we should be treating each other solely in terms of our individual standing. We leave folk to sort of fumble their way through this, often with ugly results and often with social disruption.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeff. That whole notioning of the other, isn't it? That sometimes, and often if the part of the problem is, of course, you start from the white centrality, and then diversity is anyone that's not white. They become the other, and they're not part of the Australian identity or national consciousness. So we've heard about how racism operates, but I'm an optimist. I always think we can do better. I think Rosalind Croucher last night said she's a glass half full person. So am I. I'm of the same view. You have to be. You have to believe that you can do better for our children, for our children's children. So one of the things that we've been doing at the Australian Human Rights Commission, the fantastic race discrimination team, some of whom are here today, shout them out, they're brilliant. They've been working on a national anti-racism framework. People ask me, what is that? It's a fair question. What I would say it is it's a call of action to all levels of government and to the civic and business sectors to bring about the changes across all areas of our life that are required to combat racism. It begins with improving racial literacy, which we are actually quite poor at in this country. And then it then moves on to address racism, but particularly structural racism in the significant areas of life: education, employment, justice, data collection, and the media. And it is actually a once-in-a-generation opportunity to try and bring about significant change. And I think it was last night Ros asked people to put their hands up in support of the Human Rights Act, and I'm going to try and get you all to do that in terms of the National Anti-Racism Framework when we're done. But in terms of that framework, Noreen, I'll throw to you first. You talked about the difficulty in actually identifying and capturing the data on First Nations disempowerment or racism in employment. How do you think the framework could help potentially in terms of the issues First Nations people face in employment?
I don't know that it's just First Nations people.
Of course.
And I do have cultural diversity in my makeup as well. So I can speak from a number of intersecting places. But I think what I'd like to see in the framework and as we move into a new act, and I notice in the suggestions that it's all about giving business help about how they can apply. For example, in the respect at work recommendations, there's a whole lot of suggestions about helping business. Now, it seems to me, and we talked about it in the earlier session, that the problem we have, and it's almost definitive, the problem that we have in terms of the culture in employment, in employment seeking, in workplaces, in every aspect of employment, which is the biggest thing for most Australians. The problem we have is that the current acts aren't binding. And what we need to be doing in the formulation of a new act is ensuring that they are binding on workplaces. And in any framework, we have to make business accountable. We need to stop saying poor business. Now, I've worked across the community sector, the trade union movement, and then for Diversity Council Australia. So I've had a lot of experience with a lot of the different workplaces, from small business to unionised workplaces to unregulated workplaces. And I think we're too soft on them. We need to make business in this country accountable. And it's not just about anti-slavery. It's not just about free, prior and informed consent in workplaces. The data that we have from Gariella says that there's really high levels, and we knew this anecdotally, but we needed to go and find out. I mean, we talk, as Lil's laughing at me, but, and with me, but, you know, a constant topic of our whole beings and discussing the racism that we experience, but especially at workplaces. And we seek that business be accountable in all these areas, but not around the application of the Human Rights Acts. And racism is one of them. So if we're moving towards an anti-racism framework, I have a strong view that we need to make people who employ people accountable for how their workplaces look. Make the racism that, and I agree with you, Benny, we need to start coming from a strengths-based place around this, but the fact of the matter is that so many people experience racism at work and intersectional discrimination. So as we look at the framework and as we think about it being applied, my expertise is workplaces and I speak for them. The levels of racism have to stop. Is it by binding, ensuring that there is a binding nature of whatever legislative framework applies, because it can't go on.
Yeah. Something that forces action.
Something needs to happen. It can't go on as it is. Australians can't think anymore that it's the case that the policies which is for those who don't know, your policies at work are how these acts are applied in the workplace, are somehow optional to comply with. And I'll say again, and if you're a practitioner, don't get personally offended because they get into a tizzy when you say it. Human rights industry, you've had 45 years to make this effective. Do your job.
Alan, what do you think is the most important aspect of a national anti-racism framework?
Yeah, I mean, I think the proposals are great. I mean, it's the modernisation of anti-discrimination legislation, a move to a proactive model to prevent discriminatory treatment in the first place, better collection of data, stronger media standards, accountability for political leaders. I think they're all common sense approaches to better tackling racism. I think potentially the most important component will be around convening public discussion, and in particular, building a really genuine and durable understanding of the facts and effects of racial discrimination, especially amongst a significant minority in our community who I think remain really skeptical of the project. And, you know, we have done a remarkable job of moving conversations in circles like this, people who are tuned to social justice. But I think we see in Australia, and even more strongly abroad, that there is a really growing politics of resentment and grievance that is really pushing back. I mean, think of the United States, and especially where there is insecurity and precarity, our societies will rediscover this really ferocious muscle memory to blame folks that we don't understand. And it reveals that the apparent consensus that we had on some of these issues, at least in polite society, has been far more brittle, more fragile than we ever thought really possible. And so I think there is some work to be done to go back and bring these folks along. And these are people who are skeptical of the Project for Racial Justice, who often feel that they do have some genuine sense of being marginalized themselves, and who feel neglected as their communities progress in ways that they feel are moving away from them. And I get the frustration with this proposal, the idea that there should be some effort to comfort and convince those who feel alienated by really correct efforts to redress injustice. But I think it is necessary if we are going to change the hearts and minds and build and broaden this base of support for anti-racist interventions and make our societies resilient to the temptations of racism that are rupturing countries, rupturing other countries. And the other important thing, I mean, this can't be a job that falls to affected communities. Think of the weight of that burden to ask those who've been the subject of racism to prioritize the comfort of those complicit in the discrimination. Like, that would be excruciating. But there are people who have the social capital and the personal capacity to be able to lead these conversations. And if you're one of these people who can navigate the world a bit more easily, who can bear the burden of these necessary conversations, then I hope you see that as bestowing some obligation on you. And I reckon that that building of real broad understanding and resilience in our communities is what will energize and make possible the rest of the framework.
Sasonke, can storytelling sell a framework?
Yeah, I think what basically like what Alan said, essentially, like everything that Alan said, I think is entirely correct. I do worry about racial literacy in this country. I do worry about the capacity to hold the complexity of the discussions that we're having, which on the one hand are crystal clear, right? Racism is bad. We understand where it comes from, that there's a long history. So on the one hand, it's very straightforward and not complex at all. And on the other hand, it is made complicated, I think, by an environment in which we are constantly having to deal with false equivalencies, where criticisms of the actions of certain people or certain actors are called out for what they are not. So we are constantly having to deal with distractions around the conversation about racism, and that's because the level of racial literacy in this country is very, very low. I think that's a function of a choice. Conversations about race and racism don't have to be complicated. They are made complicated by people who have an interest in keeping them complex. And so I guess that's the way to get back to this notion of the kinds of stories that we tell. I think we have a media that is deeply problematic and deeply invested in telling stories that aren't always truthful, in telling partial stories, in mistelling stories. So the dark side of storytelling is that there is, of course, disinformation and stories that aren't true, right? So there is truth, meaning multiple ways of understanding what is real. And then I think there are ways of obfuscating. So we saw, in the last week, this criticism, of Laura Tingle, and calling her out for this comment about Australia being racist. There's nothing controversial about that statement. But what is happening in that moment is that some elements of the media are choosing not just to call her out, but to chill all of us. So all of us will think twice before, not only do we seek to defend her, let alone defending her, simply talking about racism and saying that there's racism in this country, that it is a long history of racism, and that racism is real in Australia. So the minute you say those words, you become aligned with the kind of people who will be targeted. So that chilling effect is deeply dangerous. And so yes, of course, stories are very important in how we think about the dissembling that's going on. but it has to be built on a bedrock of a much stronger sense of racial literacy, where we don't get into these false equivalencies. I think the coverage similarly of what's happening in Gaza has been pretty shocking, right? Because as we saw at the climate change debates, there's this and there's that. Well, climate change is real, climate change is not real. We're going to give equal amounts of time to both sides of that argument. I think we have to start to be able to tell what's what from what by having a far more literate, racially literate. Similarly, when it comes to Gaza and Palestine, we need a much more internationally literate ability to have a conversation that is not always bringing us back to very basic points, when really we need to elevate the discussion and be able to say what is actually happening in the context of a place in which there's genocide going on, right? So I think how we choose to tell stories matters very much in a context in which the repercussions for saying certain words and for speaking in a certain way are very particularly profound. It is hard to say these words, and we need to be able to get to a place where there's enough racial and community literacy where there isn't a blowback, even if people disagree with us. There doesn't have to be a coming for people that seeks to bring them down for saying certain words. Yeah.
Jeff, if you're in my shoes and you were trying to convince government of all levels to take up a national anti-racism framework, what would you say?
I'd say, what's your shoe size?
14. No.
I'd say that I think the key question here is how to make multicultural democracies work. And that liberal democratic core values matter. I mean, they call for a reason. Liberty must include some cultural liberty. Equality must include people of diverse backgrounds and interests. And democracy must include all citizens and allow all voices to be heard. To reprise something that Michael Kirby said last evening, I think it's deeply disappointing, hugely disappointing, that the Liberal Party declined to participate in the parliamentary committee that is overseeing the Commission's initiative for the NAF. And I think the Liberal Party and other parties who declined need to be pressed to explain their disinterest or their lack of interest, and or to explain and justify their opposition to it. As Attorney General years ago in the Abbott government, George Brandis tried to explain his and his government's opposition by saying that they supported the classical liberal rights, freedom of speech, assembly, worship, the press, and everything else was social justice. But in a country that now comprises 30% of its population was born somewhere else, rising to 50% if you include at least one parent born somewhere else, simply insisting on the classical liberal rights alone is not going to make for a successful multicultural democracy. It's not even going to produce a representative democracy. And the other thing I would say is to pick up on the Commission's advocacy for a preventative rather than a reactive approach to anti-racism in this country. I couldn't agree more with that. However, speaking as a political theorist, I suggest that something more than freedom and equality are required. Liberty and equality lend themselves to being protected legally, but you can enjoy the rights to liberty and equality and still be marginalized in all sorts of subtle and not so subtle ways. And I think the Anglosphere, Australia is not alone in this respect. The Anglosphere has a tradition of emphasizing liberty and equality, but forgetting the third value in the revolutionary liberal credo, fraternity, which is a bit sexist. Let's call it inclusion. And so I think the banner should be free, equal, and included. and not just free and equal.
Thanks, Steph.
Mm.
Nora, we're running out of time, so I might, I wanted, well, look, I guess it's hard to do it quickly, but maybe
30 seconds.
as best you can. I'm going to ask Benny the last question.
Yeah.
But in terms of one of the things the framework has to deal with is structural racism, I suppose. Is there a way in which you think it can do that? Do you think?
Yeah. As I mentioned, I guess in my opening remarks, we really need to understand exclusion before we can talk about inclusion, and we can talk about the sort of the prevention. And the reality is Muslims, you know, the Muslim community face a number of structural, you know, racism, whether it's, you know, employment discrimination. The reality is a you know, person with a Muslim sounding name or a Middle Eastern sounding name, as you know, research has shown by ANU and University of South Australia, 64 times will have to apply, 64 times more than somebody with an anglicized name. And that's with employment, but they could have, and many Muslims are very highly educated, and yet the economic and employment outcomes don't match that. So that's shown in the ABS. And we can even talk about sort of the legal as well, you know, the legal racism or anything really to do with counterterrorism. You know, the reality is the Muslim community feel quite vulnerable when it comes to, you know, what they might perceive as and do perceive as a double standard when it comes to, you know, their legal standing. And we see this play out in the media, or the political discourse as well. We've seen in recent times when a 16-year-old boy, the alleged stabber in Wakeley, was immediately deemed a terrorist, like immediately deemed terrorist, even though he is known to have mental health issues. And yet, you know, the 40-year-old stabber who killed 5 women and 1 Muslim male, and he was ideological, was not deemed a terrorist. So under the sort of the legal racism itself, but I really want to talk about what's happening now and what I'm seeing in my role as Executive Director of Islamophobia Register Australia is this massive increase, very concerning increase of Islamophobia happening every single day. So, and I know she's retracted it. So, you know, Gary and I had a conversation this morning. So when Senator Sarah Henderson said there is no Islamophobia, it shocked us. I mean, we are seeing this every single day. We are dealing with cases every single day. What used to be 1 case a month before October 7th, now we're seeing 20, 30 cases a day. And these are just the ones that have been reported. I was in Perth and Adelaide all last week, and the number of people who've told me they've had an Islamophobic incident happen the last few months, but yet have not reported it, just is really an understatement of really how wide-reaching Islamophobic and hate crime is in these issues. Today, we're dealing with a case in Melbourne where it was quite horrific, where a swastika was actually spray painted, graffitied on a driveway. In fact, I'm giving you guys, you know, giving you guys a little bit of a heads up because there's going to be a news story on it. So swastika and death, I think it was death to Muslims with the C word that I can't pronounce, and, you know, death to Palestinians. So here's a woman going out, you know, throwing out her rubbish at about midnight, seeing this spray painted, you know, on. And so to say that, you know, Islamophobia and hate crimes is not a real thing is deeply concerning, because how do we get to this national anti-racism framework if we don't even acknowledge where this exclusion is, where this safety? So you talk about data, centralized data is exactly what we're all about. This is what the Islamophobia Register Australia is all about. It's we need to be able to grab the data to then be able to provide the education. So all of the principles of the framework is really it really hits home for us as a register, because it's all these things that we want to put in place. We want, you know, educational programs for racism. We want to talk about cultural safety. We want to talk about media regulation and media representation. We want to talk about justice and the legal protections. This is what's going to make us a robust, inclusive, cosmopolitan society that we want, that we humanize each other. I think the other night, you know, you spoke about that. How do we humanize each other? We humanize each other by seeing each other as completely equal. And the only way to be able to do that is to be able to address these issues of exclusion.
Thanks, Tori. We are out of time really, but Benny, a message of hope to finish on.
Well, I think I need to start with this very quickly. When I first got my job as a manager more than 10 years ago, the lady who hired me was an Aboriginal woman by the name Cass McKenzie. And that's what happened. When you don't see the race, you don't see the ethnicity or tribe. And then she did not just hire me to work with her under Aboriginal services. She also empowered me. She gave me the resources and the authority to make decisions. And as she did that, I was able to receive the Medal of the Order of Australia. And that had nothing. And when I got this necktie, it was also presented to me in the parliament by one of the Indigenous elders, Antifeki Tatman. Has nothing to do with the African community or migrant communities. That's how we need to see ourselves. See someone with the potential and empower them, and that will empower all the community. We've seen the incident in Red Bank Plain in Queensland a few months ago, and no political leader wanted to talk at that particular time. And our children were not going to school. So a lot of parents did not want to send their children to school. And what I did was to look for a number of the daughter of the elderly who was killed by some of the young people. And I made a decision to go there at night. I did not consult any of my relatives or friends because I did not want anybody to scare me, to say, don't go. So I made a decision and I said, I'm going to go. I called her and I said, I'm coming.
Those
And
kids
she
would have
said, come.
loved that.
So I went there at night.
Yeah.
And I was the only Black person there. There were too many white people, right? They welcomed me. I was not scared, all right? And what happened was I said to Cindy, we need to call for a media conference in the morning because we have to separate the hate that's out there and what happened to your mom, because that has nothing to do with your mom. That's not the legacy for your mom. We need to go out there in the morning. Let's call for a media conference and isolate those voices. And we need to make sure that this had nothing to do with race. We did that. Within 1 hour, the whole narrative changed to a positive story.
Thank you, Ben.
That was, thank you so much for sharing that story. What a very powerful way to end. Giri, did you want to say a few words to close your session?
Oh, because I've totally stuffed this and run it over time. All I wanted to do is a quick poll. Hands up if you're in support of a national anti-racism framework.
Yeah.
All in favour say aye. Yes, the ayes have it. Thanks. That's all I want to say.
Oh, please give this panel and Giri a big round of applause.
Right.
How incredible. Tackling such a huge topic with their expert analysis and lived experience. Thank you so much. We're going to reset the stage for our next session. So thank you so much, everyone.